They took less than 3 minutes to handcuff him, but it only took another 3 minutes after that for the entire airport to fall silent. Not because of a blaring siren, not because of an explosion, but because of the truth about the man they had just arrested. A black soldier, a military uniform still coated with the dust of a distant battlefield. Eyes that held no anger, no shouting, just quiet, as if he had grown used to being misunderstood. Have you ever witnessed a moment where every eye in the room stopped not because of an action, but out of disbelief? This didn't happen in the middle of nowhere, not in the dead of night. It happened right at Gate 22 in the heart of America, a place where everyone believed they were safe as long as they did things right. And then, someone started recording. A phone trembled slightly in a passenger's hand. A whisper was heard. "Wait, isn't that a military uniform?" And just a few minutes later, that video would force an entire system to explain itself. But you need to understand this. This isn't just a story about a mistaken arrest, not just a viral video. It's about the collision between prejudice and honor, between skin color and a uniform, between a man who risked his life for his country and a nation that seemed to have forgotten who he was. Today we'll go deep into that story, not just to understand what happened, but to understand why it happened, and most importantly, what happens next. Are you ready? Because what you're about to hear might just make you rethink how you judge someone. That morning, the airport was more crowded than usual. Long lines stretched before the check-in counters. Tired passengers silently pushed their luggage, all hoping to make their flight on time. No one noticed the black man walking slowly through the main hall. He wore a khaki military-style jacket. His hair was neatly trimmed, his stride firm like someone long acquainted with discipline. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He wasn't loud. He didn't cut in line. But just minutes later, he was surrounded by 4 police officers shoved to the ground and handcuffed right at the boarding gate. No one knew what was going on. Some people stepped back. Some pulled out their phones to record. A child held his mother's hand and asked Mom, "Why are they arresting that man?" The mother had no answer. The scene brought silence over the entire Gate 22 area, not because people understood what was happening, but because they didn't understand why it was happening and because it felt far too familiar. Have you noticed this? In so many public arrests, the person being restrained is often black, not because they're more dangerous, but because someone thinks they look suspicious. And the sad truth is, when a white man in a hoodie walks through an airport, no one notices. But when a black man, even if he's wearing a worn military jacket, even if he's done nothing wrong, stands in the wrong place, he can instantly become a suspect. The police didn't offer an explanation at first. They simply said it was a precautionary measure, that they received a report of suspicious behavior. They didn't say who reported it. They didn't say what he allegedly did. They just handcuffed him as if he didn't deserve to be asked first. And then murmurs began. A passenger noticed, "Looks like he's wearing a uniform." Look closely. There's a badge on his chest. Another rewound the video they just recorded, zoomed in. And sure enough, a small eagle insignia, the symbol of a senior officer in the United States military. So what really happened? How did a soldier, someone who served the country, end up being publicly arrested like this? And did they even know who he was? Or worse, did they know but simply didn't care? This is where we need to pause, not out of rage, but to understand the man himself. Not just through the actions of the police, but through the life he lived and what he represented. Because behind those handcuffs lies a long story about honor service and how society judges people not by what they've done, but by something they can't change: the color of their skin. Let's rewind a little so we can understand. Who was he and why did this moment force America to pay attention? His name is Elijah Monroe. Over 20 years in the U.S. military, he had served in Iraq, led peacekeeping operations in East Africa, and received a medal for saving a group of young soldiers during an ambush in Kandahar. In the military, they called him the Quiet Shield. Never loud, never boastful, but always on the front lines where it was most dangerous. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a husband, a father of 2 college-age sons, and a son who always kept a photo of his mother in his wallet. In that photo, she wore a Sunday dress standing in front of a small church in Georgia, where she once taught Elijah to be humble in strength and proud in compassion. Elijah had never been in trouble, no criminal record, no traffic violations, nothing that would make someone think he was a threat. He was calm, courteous, and like many veterans returning home quietly moved through crowds without seeking praise. But sometimes that very quietness made it easy for people to forget who he was. Or worse, they never cared enough to know. In truth, there are many people like Elijah, men and women who fought for a country that doesn't always recognize them as heroes. Did you know, according to a 2022 survey, nearly 42% of black veterans said they felt more often suspected or monitored after leaving the military solely because of their race? A striking example is Lieutenant Karen Nazario, a black officer who was pulled over, pepper sprayed, and held at gunpoint by Virginia police while wearing his military uniform simply because they thought he wasn't complying properly. Only when the video went viral did people see the truth. Even a uniform is not immune to bias. Elijah didn't get angry. When he was arrested at the airport, he didn't yell, "I'm a high-ranking officer." He simply asked, "Can you tell me why?" But no one answered, perhaps because they had no reason. Or worse, they thought they didn't need one when dealing with someone like him. And that is the real problem. In a civilized society, power should never come before justice. But here, identity seemed to be determined not by how you lived, but by how others saw you. Elijah's story didn't just shock people. It made them think how many others like him had been treated the same way without anyone ever knowing. And if no one had recorded that day, if there had been no viral video, would anyone have believed it happened? But sometimes the truth doesn't need to be shouted. It just needs to appear clearly at the right moment to change everything. And yes, just minutes later, one of the officers began whispering into his radio. His expression changed. Then two more officers appeared, not to cuff Elijah again, but to remove the handcuffs. The group of officers fell silent, and in their eyes, for the first time, there was something that hadn't been there before: fear. They had just realized the man they had detained wasn't just another civilian. He was someone who had the authority to review their own security clearance records, and that moment was when the truth flipped everything on its head. Elijah didn't raise his voice. He didn't resist. He simply stood still, hands raised, eyes slowly scanning each of their faces as if searching for a reason. But that reason didn't come from his actions, not from his words. It came from something beyond his control: his skin color. When witnesses were later asked why they thought Elijah had been targeted, no one could give a clear answer. He didn't do anything wrong. He was just standing there quietly waiting to board. But he looked tense, one person said. We all know that feeling. You walk into a crowded space, stay quiet, follow all the rules, and still someone looks at you like you're a threat. And if you're a person of color in America, you know, that feeling is not rare. In truth, what happened to Elijah wasn't an anomaly. It was the product of a system long in place, what sociologists call implicit bias. It doesn't always come from hatred. Sometimes it's just a passing glance, a split-second judgment, and the consequences are very real. For instance, according to data from the ACLU, while people of color make up about 27% of the population in major airports, they account for nearly 51% of those randomly selected for extra screening by airport security. That means every time they fly, they're almost twice as likely to be suspected as white travelers. One story that went viral involved Khairuddin Maksumi, an Iraqi-American student who was removed from a Southwest Airlines flight simply for speaking Arabic on the phone with his uncle. A nearby passenger reported that they didn't understand what he was saying and felt unsafe. No evidence, no violation, just a feeling. And feelings, though invisible, can cause very real harm. So what exactly happened to Elijah? An anonymous passenger saw him, perhaps noticed the worn uniform, perhaps didn't recognize the insignia, and filed a report with airport security. All it took was a vague note, like "blackmail looks suspicious," lingering near the boarding gate. And the system went into motion. No need for verification, no need for a conversation, just connect black with suspicious, and someone like Elijah becomes a person of interest. But the lesson here isn't just for those in uniform. It's for all of us, anyone who's ever judged someone based on appearance. A feeling should never be a reason to strip someone else of their equality. We may feel uneasy, we may not understand someone, but that doesn't give us the right to impose our fears onto them. Elijah once said in a speech to military students, "When you wear this uniform, people look at you in two ways, either with respect or with suspicion, and most of the time your skin color decides which. What the officers didn't know that day was, this Elijah wasn't just a soldier. He was one of the senior national security advisors who helped develop behavior response protocols in international airports. He knew how the entire system worked, the very system that had just turned on him. So when one of the security agents whispered through his radio, the others began realizing their mistake. They hadn't just detained the wrong man. They had detained someone with the power to question the system they depended on. The uniform Elijah wore that day wasn't new. It had followed him through 3 tours of duty, faded under the Middle Eastern sun, its stitching fraying slightly at the shoulders. But on his chest, a line of metal still gleamed, and the eagle insignia symbol of a senior officer remained clear. To many Americans, the uniform is a symbol of honor. It represents those who risk their lives for their country. People rise when a soldier walks into a room. They bow their heads when the flag drapes a casket, because the uniform means collective pride. But that day in the airport terminal, that uniform couldn't stop the tightening handcuffs, because to some, skin color still outweighs even the most sacred symbols. Elijah's story is not alone. Do you remember Lieutenant Richard Collins III? He was a black military officer who had just graduated from a military academy. He was stabbed to death at a bus stop by a white college student simply because he was black and wearing a uniform. The killer didn't see an officer. He saw someone he didn't want to stand next to. And here we face a painful paradox. The uniform stands for unity, but skin color still reminds us of division. Elijah once said during a national security meeting, "When I wear the uniform, they see me as a hero. But the moment I step out of the base, I'm just another black man, and that's enough for someone to call the cops." That statement may seem simple, but it lingers. It reminds us that no matter how powerful a symbol is, it cannot erase a deeply rooted bias. And in Elijah's case, the collision between a symbol of honor and racial prejudice wasn't just imagery, it was a painful lived experience. He had once hoped that his uniform would be a passport through doubt, but in the end it only made the fall harder, because the betrayal came from the very thing he trusted most. The lesson here isn't just for servicemen, it's for society as a whole, that we can't expect a symbol to fix what discriminatory thinking has broken. If real change is what we seek, we can't just honor the uniform. We must learn to see the human being before we see the fabric they wear. When Elijah's handcuffs were removed, he didn't react the way many might have expected. No anger, no demands, no public questioning. He simply asked one thing: "Do you know who I am?" And the officer, the same one who had clamped his wrist just minutes before, simply nodded, speechless. The atmosphere wasn't chaotic anymore. It was heavy, silent, embarrassed. But the story didn't end there. Because what happened next would affect not only Elijah, but also social media, the news cycle, and the local police department itself. At that moment, a short conversation crackled over the security radio. The voice of the security officer receiving information from the central database grew faint, almost trembling. He whispered something to his superior, eyes shifting quickly toward Elijah. Then silence. Seconds later, the entire group of officers shifted their tone. One stepped forward to unlock the cuffs from Elijah's wrists carefully, almost sheepishly. There were no more rigid motions, no more clipped voices, only the silence of people who just realized they had crossed a line. One of them, the same man who had gripped Elijah's arms, stepped back awkwardly, stammering a half apology he couldn't finish, and Elijah stood there saying nothing. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to prove anything, because the truth alone was enough to make them lower their heads. They now knew who he was. Colonel Elijah Monroe, a senior military officer who had once received the Medal of Honor from the Pentagon for bravery under fire. A man who had participated in national security briefings, and most painfully, a man who had helped design the very airport security policies under which he had just been arrested. They hadn't detained a stranger, they had arrested their own teacher. In that moment, the truth didn't just silence the officers, it quieted the entire terminal. An airline employee froze in place. A passenger paused mid-roll of their suitcase. Someone lifted their phone again and hit record. No more cuffs, only awkward stares, slouched shoulders, and apologies that had no clear recipient. And then the clip filmed by a passenger near Gate 22 was uploaded online. No edits, no music, Just the raw footage of a man escorted, then released without a single valid explanation. Within hours, the video had surpassed 1 million views. We often believe it takes a protest, a movement, or legislation to change the system, but sometimes change begins with a small moment, a single glance, a name finally recognized, a simple question: do you know who I am? The lesson isn't just in the realization of a mistake, it's in this deeper truth. How many people are never recognized in time? How many Elijahs have walked through security checkpoints forgotten until things went too far? A soldier is respected when you know their title. But what happens when no one even bothers to ask their name? Elijah didn't sue. He didn't retaliate. Instead, he wrote a public letter sharing the experience as a lesson, not as an accusation. In the letter, he wrote, "I don't need a personal apology, but I hope that the next time someone is suspected, they'll be asked for their name before they're handcuffed." And that's when the ripple effect began. News outlets picked it up. Veterans spoke out. Citizens commented and shared, not to condemn, but to signal that the system needed fixing. But the most unexpected response came from those who had detained Elijah that day. Just hours after the incident, Elijah Monroe's internal profile was opened before people who never expected to see it. He wasn't just a colonel. He was also a strategic security advisor for the Department of Defense and the head of a specialized training program for civil protection forces, including the very airport security team that arrested him. In other words, Elijah knew the system inside and out, not just as a law-abiding citizen, but as someone who helped build it. And this is when titles, ranks, and credentials suddenly mattered, not because people respected Elijah more, but because they feared what he could do. In America, and in many places around the world, power often remains invisible until it's challenged. When Elijah stood silently in his worn uniform, he was just another suspicious-looking black man. But once people realized he had the authority to question the very procedures of airport security, everything changed instantly. Management sent apologies. The airport director ordered a full review of passenger report protocols. A closed-door meeting was called within the Transportation and Security Administration (TSA), where Elijah had once served as an advisor. And surprisingly, during an unofficial press briefing that followed, one security official admitted, "We didn't recognize Colonel Monroe. If we had known who he was, we would have handled it differently." It sounded honest, but it also unintentionally revealed the most dangerous truth of all. If he hadn't been important, would that treatment have been acceptable? That example reminded many of the story of James Blake, a professional American tennis player who was tackled to the sidewalk by New York City police officers simply due to a mistaken identity. Blake, a successful, well-dressed black athlete who had represented the U.S. in the Davis Cup. It was only thanks to his fame that the incident came to light and the police were forced to issue a public apology. But Blake spoke bluntly, "If I weren't famous, if there weren't a video, if the public didn't care, I'd have been quietly taken away and no one would have ever known what really happened." Elijah understood this deeply. He knew that if he didn't have his rank, his medals, his authority within the system, then today's apologies may have never existed. He would have simply become a case processed by procedure like thousands of nameless others. And here lies a hard truth that must be spoken: justice cannot be conditional on someone's resume. Respect cannot be reserved only for those with titles. Because if the system only behaves correctly when it fears who it wronged, then that's not justice. That's conditional power. Elijah didn't use his position to punish anyone. He didn't demand compensation. He didn't threaten. But he did ask the system to take a long look at itself. And he began from the simplest place: a question. In a later interview, he was asked, if you could change one thing about how security forces operate, what would it be? Elijah answered quietly, "I'd want them to remember that the person standing across from them might be someone who once protected them. And sometimes they need to put down their authority to truly see the human being in front of them." But what Elijah didn't expect was that from that moment forward, his story would no longer be his alone. It began to spread, not from people in power, but from everyday citizens, those who had never had the chance to be recognized in time. The video was uploaded at 3:00 p.m. No clickbait title, no dramatic soundtrack, just a single simple caption: "They handcuffed a soldier." And within 12 hours, the clip had reached over 3 million views. The first person to share it was a young woman, a passenger who had witnessed the incident. She wrote, "I don't know who he is, but the way he stood there in silence, the way they treated him, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore." Netizens quickly discovered Elijah's identity. They pieced together photos from award ceremonies, military speeches, news clips, and soon the wave of outrage began to rise. Comment after comment surfaced like long suppressed voices finally being heard. How many more times do we have to watch this happen? If even a soldier can't be respected, who will be? Thank you for staying calm. You were bigger than all of them. On Twitter, the hashtag Chasha Justice for Elijah began trending. Veterans spoke out. Many who had once served under Elijah shared their memories. "I used to serve under Colonel Monroe. He wasn't just a great leader, he protected everyone, no matter who they were." The media joined in. CNN, MSNBC, even Fox News each offered different angles, but all agreed on one thing. There was a deeper issue beyond the airport incident. Elijah's case was no longer just one man's story. It tapped into the emotions of millions of Black Americans, those who had been looked at differently even when they had done nothing wrong. People recalled the story of Henry Louis Gates Jr., a Harvard professor who was arrested right on his own front porch because a neighbor thought he was breaking in. Or Christian Cooper, an environmentalist who had the police called on him by a white woman in Central Park simply because he reminded her to leash her dog. Every time something like this happened, the country was left bewildered. Because injustice wasn't hiding in shadows anymore, it was happening in plain sight on camera, and often, no one was held accountable. But Elijah's video was different. There was no shouting, no wrestling, just a silent man and a system unraveling as it realized its mistake. And that very calmness is what woke people up. Because Elijah didn't try to prove himself with words. He let the truth do it for him. Justice doesn't need noise. It needs clarity and courage. And when the community rises not with blind rage but with reason and truth, the power of resistance becomes impossible to ignore. Elijah never shared the video. He simply thanked everyone who saw me as a human being. No grand gestures, no self-praise, just the quiet wish to be seen fully. And then under the pressure of the public, the airport authority held an official press conference. An apology was issued. An internal investigation was launched. 2 officers involved were temporarily suspended from duty. But one question still lingered in the air. Would anything actually change, or would this simply repeat itself under a different name? Because what's truly frightening isn't a single mistake. It's a system that becomes comfortable with repeating mistakes and hopes. No one is paying attention. 3 days after the incident, a spokesperson for the Transportation Security Administration held a brief press conference. Beside him stood the airport director, face tense, eyes cast down as he read the statement. "We apologize to Colonel Elijah Monroe and his family for the unfortunate experience. We are reviewing the protocols related to responding to reports of suspicious behavior to ensure such errors do not happen again." Short, formal, by the book. But when the apology video was uploaded online, the public didn't feel reassured because they didn't just want an apology. They wanted accountability. And more deeply, they wanted a real commitment to change. An apology, if it's just a set of words, isn't enough to mend what's been broken. No one could say Elijah was physically harmed that day. But what he lost was far greater, his belief that the very system he helped build would protect him the way he once protected it. On a late-night talk show that same evening, a host posed a question to the audience. How many of you have ever been treated unfairly only to receive an apology, and then nothing changed? More than half the room raised their hands because they understood the feeling of being brushed aside with a rehearsed apology is all too familiar. Similarly, the case of Sandra Bland, a Black woman arrested over a minor traffic violation who later died in jail, also received an official apology. But even today, her family still says they apologized, but Sandra never came back. And in Elijah's case, though, his story didn't end in tragedy. The wound inside him and inside the community hasn't yet healed. An apology is necessary, but if it's not followed by an admission of systemic failure, changes in protocol, and the restoration of dignity for the harm, then that apology is just an empty sound. Elijah demanded nothing. But he wrote in an op-ed published in The Atlantic, "What I hope for is not an apology. It's a guarantee that next time a person like me stands at an airport, they'll be asked their name, not labeled with suspicion. That sentence was shared thousands of times, quoted by journalists, social activists, and even young cadets learning how to serve their country without losing themselves. And then from Elijah's silence, a wave of action began. Major airports announced retraining for rapid response security teams, not just on procedures, but on implicit bias. Several states proposed legislation requiring officers to record a specific reason before detaining any individual. Military academies began including Elijah's story in their curriculum as a living lesson in composure, dignity, and the power of truth. And so, even though the apology wasn't enough, the actions that followed, if they truly happen, might be what helps the system begin to change. But even now, one question still haunts many. What would have happened if no one had recorded that video that day? And that is where this story needs to continue. Not to relive the past, but to look directly at a reality where the silence of a camera lens can erase a person from the public memory. Just imagine this. What if that day, no one pulled out a phone, no video went viral, no images of handcuffs, no glances of regret from bystanders? What would have happened? Maybe Elijah would have been taken to a holding room, kept for hours to verify his identity. Maybe he'd be labeled as non-compliant just for asking why. And then after a few internal memos and a forced handshake, he'd quietly walk away. No one would know. No one would see. No one would speak up because there would be no evidence. And in this world, sometimes without evidence, you don't even have a story. That seemingly simple question, what if there were no camera, is the one that haunts millions of people of color in America? Because among the thousands of cases of discrimination each year, only a tiny fraction are ever captured on film. The rest become questioned accounts, dismissed reports, unacknowledged wounds, and no one held accountable. A study from the University of Chicago found police misconduct is over 3 times more likely to be punished when there is a video recorded by a civilian compared to when there is only verbal testimony. That means the truth only has power when someone sees it. Think back to the case of Rodney King in 1991. If not for a handheld camcorder from a neighbor's balcony, would the footage of him being brutally beaten have ever reached American TV screens, or more recently, George Floyd? It was those 8 minutes and 46 seconds captured by a 17-year-old black girl that shook the world. That girl, Darnella Frazier, would later be awarded a special Pulitzer citation for courageously recording the truth when most would have looked away. Elijah was more fortunate than they were. He didn't lose his life. But without that video, would his name ever have been known? Would the apology have been issued? Would reform even have been considered? Or would it all have been reduced to a sterile line in a security log? Suspicious behavior, non-compliant, processed per protocol. And that's why this isn't just about a phone. It's about the right to be seen, the right to tell your story, and the right to live in a society where truth doesn't have to be debated, but is recognized from the start. We often say justice is blind, but in truth, justice can only exist if someone chooses to open their eyes. After the incident, Elijah wrote a short message on social media, not to recount what happened, but to thank the woman who bravely stayed, who lifted her phone when everyone else walked away. He wrote, "I was able to stay calm because I knew someone was watching. Someone bore witness. And in that moment, I was no longer alone." That is the true power of the camera, of social media, and of ordinary citizens who choose not to look away. Not everyone is a colonel. Not everyone has a title or fame. But everyone deserves to be seen and to be treated as human. And that is the first step toward change. Because dignity doesn't come from rank, and justice should never depend on who's holding the camera. It must come from how we treat one another, even when no one is watching. When the storm died down, Elijah stopped appearing in front of cameras as much as he had in those early days. He didn't chase interviews. He declined talk show invitations. He simply returned to his old life, simple and quiet. In the mornings, he took his daughter to school. In the afternoons, he went to the Veterans Center counseling young soldiers recently discharged. No one mentioned the airport incident to him directly. But everyone knew they were in the presence of a man who had stood firm in the face of humiliation and still kept his dignity. The uniform was just a shell, a symbol, a coat stitched with medals, ranks, titles. But true dignity, it wasn't in the fabric. It was in how you face injustice, how you stay composed when others lose control, and how you choose kindness, not revenge, when you have every right to retaliate. Elijah could have sued, could have used his position to punish, but he didn't, because to him, dignity is not something others give you, it's something you live to prove every day. Elijah's story may have concluded, at least in the media, but it opened a new chapter in many people's thinking. A young security officer at the airport once wrote on an internal forum, "I used to think just following procedure was enough. But now I've learned sometimes the right thing is to stop, look a person in the eye, and ask them one simple question: how can I help you?" And what could be more profound than when a mistake, rather than being buried, becomes the starting point for transformation? Dignity, if you pay attention, is never loud. It doesn't need a stage, doesn't need applause. It only needs a small space where you are allowed to be yourself and still stand tall when others try to break you. And if there is one thing this story leaves behind, it is a quiet but undeniable reminder. Don't wait until someone wears a uniform to respect them. Don't wait until a video goes viral to believe what they say. And don't wait until they lose their composure to call them human. Because in the end, titles can be taken, uniforms can be hung up. But dignity, that's what you carry for life. And that is what Elijah Monroe leaves us with. Not just a soldier, not just a victim, but a living example of calm integrity and courage in silence. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. We hope that when you turn off this screen, you'll look at the world around you a little differently. Listen more deeply, ask more thoughtfully, and remember that everyone is carrying a story worthy of being seen and respected. If you've made it this far, then perhaps there's something stirring in your heart too. Maybe frustration, maybe compassion, or perhaps just a moment of quiet reflection. Elijah Monroe's story isn't the story of one man. It's the story of how we treat each other when no one else is looking. It's the story of holding fast to your values, even when those values go unrecognized. And it's the story that reminds us every glance we give someone might shape their entire day. If you believe that human dignity should come without conditions, if you believe that justice belongs to everyone, not just the titled and powerful, then help us share this story. Share this video with a friend. Comment below. What have you witnessed that made you feel people need to be seen more? And if you want to walk with us through stories like this, hit subscribe, because we will keep telling them for those whose voices haven't yet been heard. Because sometimes, the kindest thing we can do is to listen, really listen before we judge. And as Elijah taught us, dignity isn't something someone gives you. It's something you live to prove every day.